for some successful case studies and some best practices, especially the conversation that is coming up next with Professor Alan of the New South Institute. He's joining us from the UK live here on Zoom on Biashara Tuesday. We're going to discuss some of the papers that he has been publishing and some of the work he has done in the past. I'm looking at one here that reads Zimbabwean migrants, that is South Africa's anti-immigrant sentiments, which are hindering policy reforms. For us to have economic integration across the regions, we need to have movement of people, goods, and services with little to no hindrances. How can we do that? Should we look at the financial architecture? Should we take a look at our migration policies? Or are there some historical policies that needs to be re-evaluated even as we move forward in this African free continental trade agreement, but also integration of all the 54 states in the African Union? He'll be having us, he'll be answering all our questions, so please send them through on our social channels. I'll be taking them and also forwarding them to him. Later, conversations are also continuing on a Biashara Tuesday. In the newspaper review section is Dennis Kimani joining us once more. He is the chairman and CEO of the Youth Green Society. We're going to discuss about what are the headlines talking, of course, taking precedence on the activities of last week, the demonstrations, and also the economic and political fluctuations have been witnessed in the country for the past 1 month. The role of the youth and the state of youth and the economy is a discussion I'm having with Robert Njenga, who is head of marketing and partnership at WYLDE. He'll be telling us what they do over there, but also what position are the youth taking up in this society, and what is the role of the state in ensuring that business and economic development is realized by a majority of the youth population. So don't go far. Coming back with that conversation with Professor Alan. He's already on Zoom, so do not touch that dial. All right, let's go right into it. I'm welcoming Professor Alan, who is right now joining us from the UK. Good morning to you, Professor.
Good morning. Very good to be on your show. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
I'm mostly in the Western Cape, but I'm currently in the UK.
Okay, all right. Maybe just a little bit introduction to you. Of course, you've taught at UCT. You've also been at the South Africa Department of Trade and Industry all the way from the 1990s. You've been a visiting scholar at the Harvard Business School, also a regular visiting professor at other institutions as well. What is your area of focus? Because I see you have a very, diverse, you have diverse experience, and also your portfolio is quite robust.
Thank you. Yes, well, actually, I was also in the President's office in South Africa for 10 years, until I returned to the University of Cape Town when I started the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance. It's a good point. I guess my broad focus is African economic development. A lot of my work has been on South Africa for the last 25, 30 years. But in the last 5 years, I've been focusing on migration issues and how internal migration issues in Africa can contribute to economic and social development, political stability, and what are some of the opportunities and what are some of the obstacles for improving the way that Africans cross African borders in order to achieve those objectives.
Right. Of course, when it comes to migration and migration policies, it doesn't look uniform across, the African states. It seems to be fluctuating from time to time. The migration policies are constantly in a flux. Why? How would you say, or how would you answer to this question? Why are they not uniform?
Well, as you said a few minutes ago, there are more than 50 countries in Africa. And they have different histories. They mostly have a history of colonialism, but they have quite different histories in many ways. Some are rich countries, some are poor countries, some are countries which have been developing quite fast, some are countries which have struggled. So I think in all those different circumstances, the response of the government would be quite different. So you have a pattern really, where in the northern part of Africa and in the southern part of Africa, countries have been slower to open their borders, and in East Africa and in West Africa, countries have been more advanced. So in the East African community in particular, and in the ECOWAS in West Africa, since 1979 in ECOWAS, there have been movements towards opening borders. And I wouldn't be too negative about Africa. I think there have been crises. There are often refugee crises in certain parts of Africa. But on the whole, the trend is positive. On the whole, the trend is towards more open borders, relatively more open borders.
Right. Maybe just to close up on that bit of negativity before we move to more positive, and also taking a look at viable paths, why do we experience a bit of hostility when it comes to a few of these African states?
Well, you have some African countries which are afraid. I mean, look, take the situation in Tunisia at the moment. Tunisia has been going through since the Arab Spring, about 10, 12 years ago. Tunisia has been going through quite a lot of political turmoil and quite problematic economic policies. And they have an unemployment problem. They have a lot of educated young people who are not getting decent jobs. And then you have a situation where they have a perception that people are coming into their country. The government is, in that case, I think in other cases in Africa, sometimes takes the easy path of blaming foreigners for mistakes that they've made themselves or for issues that they can't resolve. So there are situations where countries are afraid to open their borders, and where they actually use the fact that there are foreigners in their country, more foreigners coming into their country than before, as a way of deflecting the political issues that they should be dealing with. So that's one of the examples. Mm-hmm. But I think in many parts of Africa, there's a recognition that more open borders can contribute to economic development.
Mm-hmm. All right. So how can then African countries, would you advise, have a more welcoming stance towards migrants and other stakeholders?
Well, your focus is on economic development. I think the first thing that we need to think about is how can we promote the kind of migration that does support economic development. So there are a couple of examples. Kenya is a country that is growing fairly rapidly. Normally, at the moment, there's a tough period, but I think most people expect Kenya to be back on a path of growth in the near future. And you need skilled people. You need people from all parts of the world who have IT skills, who have skills in certain technologies, who bring capital with them for investment. And if your borders aren't sufficiently open to accommodate investors and business people and technology people, then you're going to grow much more slowly than otherwise would be the case. So that's one example. Another example is some African countries have large numbers of relatively low-skilled migrants. So in South Africa's case, on the mines and on the farms to some extent, there are quite a lot of migrants from other countries in Southern Africa who come regularly. They come either in the mines for most of the year and then go home for a month and come back, or they come for seasonal work, like in agriculture. And in those cases, we can create a situation where those workers are more secure, where they have a long-term future, rather than being resented by the population that lives in the country. There are ways of improving the relationship between countries and their relatively low-skilled labor migrants as well.
All right. And when we're taking a look at major obstacles, which one will you say are the key, which are hindrances to the movement of migrants seeking to cross African borders? I know we have passports and visa requirements, but maybe there are others that you can point out to us, and how can they be effectively eliminated from a practical point of view, given, of course, the various different economic situations and also national institutions that we have across all these states?
Well, let's not forget that Africa is a very large continent, and there are countries in parts of Africa that have very little contact with each other, and they don't understand each other's system of government. They don't understand each other's management systems for home affairs, for security, for documentation, and so on. So I think the first and the most important thing is that African countries across the continent have much more opportunity to engage with each other at a technical level, so that the senior officials in the key departments that are looking after migration get to understand how other countries work. So what you do find is that countries within a region are more likely to open their borders to each other. So, for example, in East Africa, you already have an East African passport. You have relative freedom of movement between all the members of the East African community. Between Kenya, Uganda, and Rwanda, you're allowed to cross the borders without even a passport, as long as you have a valid identification document. So these are countries which are actually neighbors. And I think that most of the progress that we're going to have over the next few years is going to be within those regional communities. But we need to prepare Africa for opening borders to a greater extent to countries much further away, countries that, have relatively little contact with each other at this time.
All right. We're taking a look at problems, of course, there, and also a bit into viable paths. We're going to get into this project, of course, the framing of African migration governance reform towards a freer movement. But before we get into the project and, of course, what it's all about, what economic benefits they are going to be witnessed through this free movement of people, goods, and services?
Well, there's a lot of literature in economics which shows that if we allow people, especially skilled people, to move across borders relatively freely, and it doesn't mean completely open borders, but relatively freely, that you get a higher rate of economic development. I don't think many people would dispute that. There's also a lot of evidence that if you allow greater interaction between countries, let's take the countries of Europe, that you get greater political security. The reason for the European Economic Community, now the European Union, was that there'd been constant conflict between France and Germany and other countries on the European continent. The fact that they now interact much more regularly, that French people work in Germany, German people work in French, you have people with French first names and German second names and the opposite, means that there's a much higher level of understanding between those countries, and the level of conflict between the members of the European Union is much less than before. Of course, you do get tensions, and I think what happened in the UK with Brexit is an example of a tension that wasn't well managed. But mostly, I think you get that advantage of both greater political understanding and therefore security within a region and economic development. There's evidence for both.
All right. When we come closer home, our president here, His Excellency President William Ruto, continuously on the international platform has been calling for a new financial architecture, especially for African countries to trade within themselves. Should we also take a look at that, maybe also focusing towards a common currency in the ease of movement of goods and services?
Well, maybe down the road a common currency. I don't think that that's a priority, because what we've found is that in current world economy, it's become much easier to trade across borders, even in different currencies. There are settlement systems and payment systems across borders, including in East Africa, actually, which is a pioneer in this area, where you're able to purchase things across borders relatively easily. I don't think currency is the key thing, but trade in goods and services is absolutely key. And as I'm sure most of your viewers know, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which was agreed to in the African Union in 2018, is quite far advanced down the road. Kenya's been one of the pioneers in terms of relationships within the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Within East Africa, you have the East African community, which has a relatively open borders when it comes to services and trade, and all of those relationships have been very beneficial for African development. In fact, there was work a couple of years ago by the IMF, which showed that the advantages of greater movement of capital and goods and services across borders in East Africa has made a very significant contribution to the relatively fast rate of growth in most of the East African countries today. So, Africa is not a developed continent. It's a continent where there's still many people in poverty, and many people without good jobs, and we need to think about how we're going to develop effectively.
Right. I was reading your paper earlier. I think let me start with that. It's here on theconversation.com. That is your article on Zimbabwean migrants, South Africa's anti-migrant sentiments, which are hindering policy reforms. When it comes to regularization of illegal immigrants, it's a conversation happening on a global scale. But in Kenya, it's also very pertinent. Recently, we opened borders briefly for some Somali refugees who are seeking asylum in Kenya due to political and economic tensions in their republic. How can the challenges which are rising from this free movement of people, goods, and services, what measures can be put in place to address these potential challenges and concerns, which of course are legitimate in the facilitation of this movement? We have security issues, which are not just the only one. There's labor market dynamics and cultural integration as well, which you cannot assume. How can we put effective in place measures that can address the challenges, but also allowing that free movement?
Well, I think that some African countries are doing it very well. One of your neighbors, Uganda, has a reputation in the academic world as being one of the countries which has been most successful in integrating refugees. And like Kenya, Uganda has refugees from both the Horn of Africa and from the DRC, where there's been a lot of conflict. So what do you do in those circumstances where the conflict seems to be continuing and there's little likelihood of people being able to return to their homes or their previous homes in the near future? You need to find ways to integrate them, to build a relationship between them and their surrounding communities, to encourage them to learn the local languages, to encourage them to engage with local communities, to make it easier for local communities to open themselves to the foreigners. In South Africa, for example, and there are good examples of South African practice. The practice that was decided when there was a big influx of Zimbabweans in 2008 and 2009, I mean, really, really large. In practice, we don't know exactly how many, but probably 1 million or 2. There was a decision made that we wouldn't have refugee camps, that we would rather try to integrate Zimbabweans into the broader community. Now, the government has recently made a decision that those Zimbabweans need to move from their special permits to some sort of long-term arrangement, and some of them would be able to stay in the country, some of them would have to leave. That's a difficult decision to make at this time. Up till now, I think the policies have been very good in trying to accommodate people, both in terms of not having refugee camps as far as possible, but in trying to integrate into communities and in giving people the right to work, and giving people the opportunity to learn the languages and so on. So it's difficult. There are these situations in East Africa, in Southern Africa, in other parts of Africa where there have been conflicts, and I think that we are learning to deal with them, and we can learn from each other how to deal with it. And Uganda has been setting some good examples.
All right, very good commendation to our neighbors just across here, Uganda, for setting the pace for the rest of us. Let's discuss your research project here for just a few minutes. I know we've highlighted some of those key issues and viable pathways that I've been able to read through in the research project. Let's maybe have it also up on the screen. Framing a study of African migration governance reform towards freer movement. I'm just going to ask the question which you are also asking in the second page. What are we trying to understand and why?
What we're trying to understand is what approaches by African governments will allow for freer movement more effectively. We talk about the pathways. What are the pathways to more effective integration as far as the movement of people is concerned? And the way that we're trying to understand that is by looking at experiences. So we've taken 4 African countries, South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, and Mozambique. We wanted to have one relatively poor African country, Mozambique, which has a strong migration relationship with South Africa, so that has some interesting messages. But the other 3 countries, Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa, being the economic powerhouses of their regions, they face, in fact, the most complicated situations because a lot of people want to come into those countries, and how do they handle the integration of people from surrounding countries? So we're looking at 4 countries, and we're looking at 4 regional studies. We're looking at the Southern African Development Community, we're looking at the East African Community, we're looking at ECOWAS and West Africa, and we're looking at the African Union because the African Union is trying to promote freer movement or free movement of Africans on a continental basis through a protocol which was also agreed in 2018, like the Free Trade Agreement, but has made much less progress than the Free Trade Agreement. And we believe that African countries can learn from each other, as I've been sort of suggesting now, that certainly I think South Africa can learn quite a bit from Kenya. Kenya being a regional powerhouse which has taken a somewhat more open and I would say progressive stance towards the region than South Africa has towards its region. We all face different challenges, so South Africa can't necessarily do everything that Kenya is doing, but we can do some. Nigeria can learn from Kenya, Kenya can learn from Nigeria in certain respects, and so on. And within the regions, the East African community and the West African communities have developed systems. For example, the West African passport and the East African passport, which I think is becoming quite a successful project. Systems of integration that other regions can learn from.
Right. I have a few closing questions, and I think we'll just touch a bit on the long-term sustainability and adaptability of this project, which you're currently doing, considering the evolving political and economic dynamics in Africa, which we are all aware of in all these states. How will we ensure that this research project is going to sustain itself throughout all these changing times?
Well, I think having the opportunity to speak to your viewers in Kenya is very valuable. I'll be visiting. I have a colleague who lives near Nairobi, who is working on the East African projects with me. We'll be engaging with stakeholders in Kenya, with people in government, people in international organizations, the business community, the labor unions, trying to have conversations with them about their current attitudes and what they might be open to. So I think that the key to the sustainability and the effectiveness of the project is ongoing engagement with key stakeholders in the countries that can really make a difference, and those are generally the regional powerhouses in Africa.
Right. I always like to go to the atomic level of these conversations at an individual level or a business or a non-governmental organization. What can they do to contribute to this greater cultural empathy of immigrants and also understanding and how we can foster this increased travel and movement of people and services?
Well, I think the business community, it's very important for the business community to make a very conscious effort to engage with other business communities in Africa. So to have regional business organizations which are more than just talk shops, are places where real engagement takes place. And at the individual level, I think it's important for community organizations to assist in the engagement of citizens with immigrants. So if governments make it possible and make it relatively easy for community organizations to encourage integration in regions, then I think we can make a significant contribution. And I think those individuals who are able to make a contribution should have channels where they can make a contribution to building a more integrated African society. And I'm very positive about developments. Mm-hmm. There's an annual report by the African Development Bank, which looks at visa openness in Africa. And every year, since it's started coming out in 2016, except for the COVID years, but every year there's been improvement, and there continues to be improvement in the openness of African countries. And this is in contrast to some extent to some other parts of the world which are becoming more inward-looking. Africa is becoming more open to movement across the borders, which after all were only put in place less than 150 years ago by the colonial powers.
Right. Finally, looking ahead into the future, what benchmarks or milestones should we be taking a note of to gauge the progress in these transformative initiatives?
Well, I think that we should be looking at the benchmarks that are used in the report that I just mentioned are the policies of the governments concerned. Basically, what steps are governments taking to make it easier for Africans to cross African borders? So we can look at how the borders themselves are managed. We can look at the numbers of people who are moving across borders. We can look at the measures that governments and non-governmental organizations are taking to assist in the integration of other Africans into our communities. There are quite a number of benchmarks that we can use.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Alan. Anything that we might have left, this is your chance to give a final remark.
Well, I guess my final remark is to repeat a couple of the things that I said, that we are making progress in Africa, and we're making more progress than I think many people know or realize. And we're making more progress than many other parts of the world. So compared, say, with Asia, or compared with some parts of Eastern Europe and other regions, we are making significant progress in Africa, and we need to build on that. And the way to build on that is to build relationships of all kinds across African borders. And so I thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to your viewers.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Alan, and also grateful to the New South Institute, which is working hard to strengthen delicate democracies and building effective and accountable institutions, and to you as well for creating time this morning. We are hoping we'll be keeping tabs on this research project, but also continuing this conversation on this show as well.
Thank you very much. I look forward to engaging with you again and your viewers.
Right, and say hi to Director Chipkin.
Hi, is Ivor Chipkin on the line? Okay, good. So Ivor, I think, is in Johannesburg.
Okay.
Where the organization is based, and my other colleagues, Delani Madrola and others.
Okay, great. Have a good day.
Thank you. You too.
Right, that is Professor Alan Hirsch, who's the leader of Migration Governance Reform Program at the New South Institute. You can check out the website, nsi.org.za, which is New South Institute, Strengthening Delicate Democracies by Building Effective and Accountable Institutions. We just had a conversation there on enhancing mobility and creating opportunities across African borders. This is going to be a very good step forward in shaping a more connected and prosperous Africa. So if you're in Kenya and you're checking out this conversation, it's going to be important for you to look out the opportunities which are going to arise out of this free movement